On August 6, 2012, a corroded pipe ruptured at Chevron's Richmond refinery. 15,000 people were told to shelter in place. This investigation is anchored entirely in the factual findings of the U.S. Chemical Safety Board Final Investigation Report Number 2012-03-IK. We will examine the precise sequence of events, the underlying technical failures, and the broader institutional breakdowns documented in the report that facilitated this disaster. A massive opaque plume of vapor, particulates, and black smoke formed over the surrounding community following the auto-ignition of the released hydrocarbon. The rapid chain of events resulted in a community warning system Level 3 alert. A shelter-in-place advisory was formally issued, directly affecting 15,000 residents across the densely populated cities of Richmond, San Pablo, and North Richmond. At the exact same time, within the boundaries of the facility itself, an uncontained vapor cloud rapidly engulfed 19 Chevron employees.
Section 1. The August 2012 pipe rupture. The genesis of this crisis occurred deep inside the No. 4 Crude Unit atmospheric column. The timeline details the precise escalation on the afternoon of August 6. At exactly 3:50 p.m., an outside operator discovered an active leak. The compromised pipe was an 8-inch side-cut line, releasing a continuous stream of light gas oil. The operating conditions were severe. Hazardous process fluid flowed through the pipe at a rate of 10,800 barrels per day. That's an immense volume, equivalent to 315 gallons every single minute. The internal temperature stood at approximately 640 degrees Fahrenheit, and the operating pressure at the exact location of the eventual rupture was maintained at roughly 55 pounds per square inch gauge. In response, at 5 p.m., the feed rate was reduced by 5,000 barrels per day. Despite this intervention, the 8-inch pipe completely ruptured at 6:31 p.m., violently releasing a dense, highly flammable vapor cloud. 2 minutes later, at precisely 6:33 p.m., the massive accumulation of vaporized fluid auto-ignited. 19 Chevron employees were caught squarely within the perimeter of the expanding vapor cloud. 18 of those individuals, including several operators, managed to escape the immediate zone just moments before the auto-ignition sequence occurred. Tragically, a single Chevron refinery firefighter was trapped inside a fire engine, completely caught within the ensuing fireball. The U.S. Chemical Safety Board report documents the narrow escape on page 1, stating verbatim, "Because he was wearing full-body firefighting protective equipment, he was able to make his way through the flames to safety." 6 specific employees suffered minor injuries during the chaotic evacuation. The heavy-duty fire engine itself was entirely consumed and destroyed by the intense heat.
Section 2. Technical failure, sulfidation corrosion. The mechanical failure was traced to an exact physical location within the vast network of process piping.
The confirmed mechanical failure mechanism is sulfidation corrosion. This is a progressive damage mechanism causing gradual thinning in iron-containing materials, like the standard carbon steel used throughout the refinery. It's driven by a continuous chemical reaction between sulfur compounds and iron at extremely high operating temperatures, generally ranging from 450 degrees to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Because raw crude oil naturally contains aggressive sulfur compounds, such as hydrogen sulfide, this highly corrosive mechanism is an inherent risk at virtually every petroleum refinery processing high-sulfur crude oil feeds.
The CSB Final Investigation Report establishes the specific technical cause of the disaster on page 5, stating directly, "The rupture of the four-side-cut piping resulted from the 52-inch component being extremely thin due to a damage mechanism known as sulfidation corrosion. Decades of exposure to this precise mechanism meant the carbon steel piping wall had deteriorated past any acceptable safety margin. It ultimately reached failure thickness, rendering the 52-inch component fundamentally unable to contain the highly pressurized, high-temperature light gas oil." Chevron was not blind to this vulnerability. The corporation's own internal corrosion prevention and metallurgy manual extensively documented the catastrophic nature of this exact damage mechanism well prior to the August 2012 incident. The CSB report highlights this prior knowledge on page 36, quoting the internal Chevron manual directly. "Sulfidation corrosion has caused severe fires and fatalities in the refining industry, primarily because it causes corrosion over a relatively large area, so failures tend to involve ruptures or large leaks rather than pinhole leaks." The rate at which this potentially fatal corrosion occurs depends heavily on the exact metallurgical composition of the individual pipe segment, specifically its localized silicon content. Carbon steel piping containing less than 0.10 weight% silicon can corrode at dramatically accelerated rates, sometimes up to 16 times faster than higher silicon carbon steel, operating under the exact same conditions. The 52-inch component that violently failed was manufactured from an industry standard known as ASTM A53B carbon steel. Crucially, this specific grade of steel possessed no required minimum specification for silicon content. Post-incident metallurgical testing revealed the failed 52-inch component had a silicon content of just 0.01 weight%. In stark contrast, the adjacent elbow connected directly upstream had a silicon concentration of 0.16 weight%, and consequently showed considerably less physical thinning. This severe variance in localized piping materials presented a profound inspection challenge. The facility actively relied on a limited number of predetermined condition monitoring locations to estimate the overall health of the piping systems. 19 separate monitoring locations were placed along the 8-inch line, but none of them were located on the exact 52-inch component that ultimately failed. Highlighting this inherent flaw in partial representative inspection regimes, the CSB report quotes the American Petroleum Institute Standard 93C on page 42. Unless the refinery is fortunate enough to have located an inspection point on that particular low silicon section of pipe or fitting, it is very difficult to detect the thinning component. This specific material vulnerability was extensively documented industry-wide. American Petroleum Institute recommended Practice 939C openly illustrated a similar case involving a low silicon pup piece that ruptured at a BP refinery under related circumstances. The formal industry guidance explicitly warned of the exact phenomenon seen at Chevron: unmonitored, accelerated thinning in localized, low silicon piping components surrounded by thicker, higher silicone piping. This dynamic effectively hides the imminent danger from routine, spaced-out ultrasonic inspections. Section 3. Institutional process safety failures. The physical pipe rupture was directly preceded by long-standing organizational breakdowns. The fatal hazard of variable sulfidation corrosion rates could have been eliminated by simply upgrading the piping material from carbon steel to a higher-chromium steel, specifically an alloy known as 9-chrome. Discussing the foundational engineering principle of inherently safer design, the CSB report notes on page 46. The concept of inherent robustness applies to designing equipment to be impervious to the corrosion mechanisms that are present given the materials of construction and within the process and the operating conditions. Chevron repeatedly rejected internal, documented recommendations from their own reliability personnel for this exact metallurgical upgrade. The chronology of missed opportunities spans several critical years. In 2006, a formal corrosion mitigation plan explicitly recommended upgrading the foresight cut piping to a safer metallurgy. Yet, during the 2007 Crude Unit turnaround, the requested upgrade was officially denied by management. By 2009, the Chevron Energy Technology Company issued a comprehensive sulfidation failure prevention initiative, strongly recommending 100% component inspection on all high-temperature carbon steel piping to find low silicon vulnerabilities. Despite this directive, during the massive 2011 turnaround, a renewed recommendation to upgrade the piping was denied once again. Chevron's rigid administrative justification process for approving turnaround work demanded localized physical thickness measurements to authorize any pipe replacement. During the 2011 turnaround, components of the adjacent 12-inch line were found to be severely thinned and were immediately replaced. However, the connected 8-inch line was deliberately left in active service because specific physical inspection data on that exact localized line segment was absent. The CSB report documents this systemic institutional failure on page 67, stating, "The requirement for hard data to justify turnaround work even affected decisions to mitigate hazards identified during a turnaround." This chain of assumptions proved fatal during the incident itself. When the initial leak began on the afternoon of August 6th, the incident command structure entirely failed to identify the severe thinning of the pipe. Responders believe the pipe still possessed sufficient wall thickness, based largely on the flawed 2011 inspection data taken from the nearby high silicon elbow. The CSB report confirms this critical error on page 94, noting, "All emergency response activities were conducted under the assumption that the foresight cut pipe was of acceptable thickness beneath the insulation." Consequently, firefighters were sent to manually remove the aluminum jacketing and insulation from an actively leaking hydrocarbon line using a specialized tool called a pike pole. As the crisis unfolded, 40 individuals entered the highly dangerous Crude Unit during the active leak event. This group included routine operations personnel, specialized inspectors, scaffolding builders constructing platforms near the leak, and multiple firefighters. The established physical control boundaries implemented by Incident Command entirely failed to account for the possibility of a catastrophic full-bore pipe rupture. The CSB report outlines this operational failure on page 92. The hot zone designated prior to the pipe rupture was not of sufficient size to ensure that individuals outside of the hot zone were safe from the high-temperature, flammable foresight cut process fluid when the sulfidation failure of the pipe occurred. The formal investigation also uncovered serious deficiencies rooted deep within the facility's safety culture. Several experienced employees correctly recognized the extreme, immediate hazard of removing structural insulation on a live, leaking, high-pressure pipe, yet they hesitated to utilize their corporate stop work authority to halt the operation. As documented on page 14 of the report, in the years leading to the August 6, 2012 incident, the Chevron Richmond refinery identified weaknesses in its stop work authority program due to employee hesitation to use stop work authority when witnessing an unsafe act.
Section 4. CSB Findings and Regulatory Legacy. The Chemical Safety Board identified substantial gaps in regulatory frameworks.
A central focus of the investigation scrutinized the highly permissive language utilized in the American Petroleum Institute Recommended Practice 939-C. While the industry guidelines openly warned of low silicon accelerated corrosion, they notably did not strictly mandate facilities to establish concrete, auditable programs to search for these hidden low silicon piping components. This lack of a strict regulatory mandate allowed vulnerabilities, like the uninspected 52-inch component isolated deep inside the Chevron facility, to remain completely unchecked. 100% component inspection was consistently presented as an option for operators rather than a strict legal requirement.
To drive permanent preventative action, the Chemical Safety Board established strict requirements for all future process hazard evaluations. The CSB report issues a firm mandate directly to state regulatory bodies on page 2, stating, require that process hazard analyses include documentation of the recognized methodologies, rationale, and conclusions used to claim that safeguards intended to control hazards will be effective. This specific directive intentionally forces industrial facilities to prioritize inherently safer systems and robust metallurgical engineering over reliance on fragile procedural safeguards. The final formal CSB recommendations submitted to the California state legislature and relevant local authorities represent a fundamental, permanent tightening of industrial oversight. The strict new requirements include mandatory documented damage mechanism hazard reviews embedded directly into all process hazard analyses. They also demand the mandatory utilization of inherently safer systems analysis during turnaround planning, the rigorous implementation of the hierarchy of controls, and a central driving objective to reduce major accident risk to levels categorized as low as reasonably practicable, commonly referred to as ALARP. The resulting regulatory shift was profound. Previous standards relied heavily on permissive inspection guidelines and highly limited, statistically questionable component sampling that frequently missed hidden defects. The recommended standard forcefully transitions the industry to a rigorous, goal-setting regulatory approach. It mandates deep, damage mechanism-specific engineering reviews and explicitly requires employers to comprehensively demonstrate the thorough application of inherently safer design principles to completely eliminate or radically mitigate specific identified hazards before a failure occurs. 15,000 residents were forced to shelter in place. 19 workers narrowly escaped catastrophic injury or death. The documented violent failure of a single, highly localized 52-inch low-silicon carbon steel component exposed immense, systemic process safety and organizational deficiencies operating at the highest levels. The mandatory implementation of damage mechanism-specific hazard reviews, coupled with rigorous, uncompromising metallurgical tracking, remains the established, definitive regulatory legacy, absolutely necessary to ensure that continuous systemic process safety oversight prevents an industrial failure of this magnitude from ever occurring again.